Good afternoon. Today is the day before Christmas, when we commemorate the birth of Jesus. But today I want to look at part of the traditional Christmas story that comes after the birth of Jesus. We find it in Matthew chapter 2. It's about, for one thing, the visit of the wise men from the east, and the fact that Joseph and Mary had to take their new baby to Egypt to keep him safe from King Herod. We can read the story in Matthew 2, starting in verses 1 and 2. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Who were these Magi? Their traditional names are Balthazar, Caspar, and Melchior. Three wise men giving three kinds of gifts to the baby Jesus. That's the Western tradition. The Eastern tradition says that there were 12 wise men with unpronounceable names. We really don't know how many there are, or where they came from. Some say India, some say Arabia, some say Persia. Matthew just says they were from the east. The precise location apparently isn't important. Most scholars conclude that they represent the Gentiles, all the non-Jewish peoples. Some traditions say they were kings, because Psalms predicted that kings would come to give homage to the Messiah. That's why we have the song, "We Three Kings of Orient Are." Besides that, anybody that had gold, frankincense, and myrrh was likely to be a king. Well, they saw some star, some tiny spot of light in the sky, and it was somehow different than other stars. And they somehow knew it signified the birth of the King of the Jews. The star didn't tell them where Jesus was, so they went to the capital city of the Jews, Jerusalem, and being wise men, they asked for directions. They came to worship him. Sometimes we have grown too familiar with the idea of how strange it is for somebody to worship a baby. The Greek word used here can mean worship. It also be used to mean to kneel before, to give homage to an earthly king, to be obedient. Matthew tends to use the word with the meaning of worship. That's how most translations render it here. The Gentile men from the east came to pay their respects to this new king of the Jews, to bow before him, to give him homage, respect, obedience, allegiance, as if they were under his authority. And verse 3 tells us, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Well, yes, King Herod was disturbed, in more ways than one. This man was so paranoid about competition that he killed 2 of his sons and 1 of his wives out of fear that they were trying to replace him. He considered himself to be king of the Jews, and anyone else who claimed that title was considered to be a political threat. So he was disturbed. And all Jerusalem was disturbed too. They weren't sure what Herod was going to do about this potential rival, but they were sure that it wasn't going to be nice. Herod was sometimes today called Herod the Great. But back in those days, kings were considered great only if they exercised great power over other people, if they killed all their rivals and forced everyone to submit. Of course, there will always be people who don't want to do the king's will, and the king gets his way only if he's got some power over them. Back then, it was the power of life and death. So all of Jerusalem was concerned about what Herod was going to do. Well, first thing he did was to order a fact-finding mission. Verse 4, when he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. Now, it's surprising he had never bothered to find this out before. In reality, he wasn't looking for a Messiah. He didn't want a Messiah. He didn't think that people needed a Messiah when they had him. He didn't have much incentive to study this on his own. But now somebody had asked about it, so he asked the religious leaders what the Scriptures said about it. In verses 4 and 5, the religious leaders said, "Well, he'll be born in Bethlehem in Judea." They replied, "For this is what the prophet has written." And they quoted Micah, chapter 5, verse 2. "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." So these folks knew where the Messiah would be born, and they heard some wise men from the east claim that the time had come for the birth. Did they go check it out? No. They didn't really want a Messiah. Most of the priests were Sadducees. Sadducees didn't believe in a Messiah. They knew what the prophet said, but they didn't believe the prophets. Didn't consider them authoritative. Besides, they already had a good life. They were well respected in the community. They did okay without a Messiah, thank you very much. But King Herod wanted to know what the legends were, so they told him. See, a legend can be a very dangerous thing. Even if it's not true, somebody can decide to make it true. Oh, a Messiah is supposed to come from Bethlehem, eh? Well, we'll go to Bethlehem and pick one of those people to be a figurehead for our movement. We'll call him the Messiah, and that might cause a few more people to support our movement. Well, Herod didn't believe in a Messiah, but he was paranoid about competition, so he decided to do something about it. Verse 7. Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." Well, we all know that Herod didn't mean it. He was telling a blatant lie, but that's what he thought he had to do to get the information that he wanted. Just who was the person that the wise men were going to choose? Maybe he hoped that they wouldn't find anybody at all. But if they did find a specific child, Herod knew how to deal with it. So verses 9 and 10, after the Magi had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star that they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, verse 10 says, they were overjoyed. See, apparently the star had disappeared for a while, and that's why they went to Jerusalem to ask for further directions. But it showed itself again, and this time it wasn't just way up in the sky, it was somehow close enough to the earth that they could see the exact place that was under the star. And that place was where Jesus was. Today, astronomers have theories about what the star really was. Some say it was a convergence of a couple of planets with a bright star, making it appear even brighter. Perhaps that could have been the first star they saw. But there's no way a real star or a planet could direct the wise men to the exact house. There is something supernatural going on there, according to Matthew, so modern astronomers are never going to figure that part out. But the wise men came to where Jesus was. Verse 11, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. They opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So by this time in the story, Jesus is not in a stable, he's in a house. We really don't know how old he is. We don't know whether the wise men first saw the star exactly when Jesus was born, or perhaps the star appeared to them ahead of time so that they would arrive in Bethlehem about the time that he was born. It could have been several months to travel from one place to another, so there might be a few months difference in those dates. Now, Joseph might have been able to be there a few months, get some carpentry work for a while. We just don't know. So the wise men gave Jesus some gifts. supposedly gold for a king, frankincense for a priest, and myrrh as a burial ointment for his death. Now, this myrrh would be an especially strange thing to give to a baby, but really it's strange to give any of these things to a baby. And they bowed down and worshipped. And then they said, well, we've been here, done that, now it's time to go home. Well, it was obvious to them that the king wasn't going to reign right away, so there was no need for them to stick around in King Herod's territory. They were wise enough to get out of there. Maybe they'd come back in 20 years and see how the new king was doing. We don't know what they were thinking because their role in the story is done. We don't hear anything more about them. Verse 12 says that they exit the stage. Having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they return to their country by another route. Now, they probably already knew, they were probably smart enough to know not to tell King Herod about this, but the dream made sure that they didn't. Actually, it's a bit surprising to me that Herod didn't already have spies there following the wise men to see what was going on, but for some reason he didn't. But he found out soon enough, I guess. Verse 13, when the wise men had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Luke describes various angels appearing to people. Matthew has dreams more often. Here it's combined. An angel appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there till I tell you. For Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. Now, if Joseph had all known from the start that he was going to end up in Egypt, it could have saved him a whole lot of trouble. He and Mary could have gone there. Nobody would know that Mary had been pregnant before the wedding. They would simply go there as husband and wife, and nobody would be any wiser about it. No scandal, no problems with lodging in Bethlehem. Much easier for everybody all around. But the birth in Bethlehem couldn't be avoided. Well, for one thing, it had been predicted by Micah the prophet. And the scandal couldn't be avoided either. And this rivalry with King Herod couldn't be avoided either. Jesus did not come into the world to make the least possible waves. He was not trying to stay out of trouble as best he could. No, he was king of the Jews. And as a king, it was inevitable that he would have political opposition. He didn't take the easy way out. He came to challenge the system because the system was wrong. Yeah, some political systems are better than others, but all of them are wrong, and Jesus came into the world because the world was wrong. It needed him. But as we know, Jesus didn't become a military Messiah to fight the world on its own terms. He was not Jesus the Great, who bashed all his enemies in the head. He was not conquering new territories, taking over empires. He was an enemy of those empires, and he won his victory over them in a very unexpected way. First, he fled. Later, he died. Jesus could have fled to Arabia. He could have fled to Syria or Asia Minor, but instead he went to Egypt. And the Jews had a long history with Egypt. Abraham had gone to Egypt. Joseph was in Egypt. Egypt had been a place of refuge, and it had been an oppressor. God's people had come out of Egypt, and now here the newly born king of the Jews was going into Egypt. And it was not unusual in itself. There were about 1 million Jews in Egypt at the time. About 1/4 of the population of Alexandria was Jewish. Many Jews had moved there because Judea was so poorly managed, and it was in constant turmoil. The economy was better in Egypt, and Joseph would be able to get work there. He would have fit in pretty well. But still there was some kind of stigma about Egypt. Every Passover, the Jews remembered that they didn't belong in Egypt. God had promised something else for them. They didn't know how it was going to happen, but they looked forward to it. Well, Joseph believed the dream that he was given. So verse 14, he got up, took the child and mother during the night, and left for Egypt. He didn't waste any time. They packed the gold, frankincense, and myrrh and got out of town as fast as they could. Traditional art shows them with a donkey, but we really don't know if they had a donkey. All we know is they left as quickly as they could. Verse 15, and they stayed in Egypt until the death of Herod. And that probably wasn't very long. Scholars who study the chronology figure that all this happened in the last year of Herod's reign. So Joseph, Mary, and Jesus may have stayed in Egypt only a year or so. And then in verse 15, Matthew tells us, and this so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. This is a quote from Hosea, chapter 11. And the interesting thing about it is that Hosea didn't give this as a prediction about the Messiah. We can look at it in Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Hosea is talking about Israel, the entire nation of Israel, and the nation is, figuratively speaking, God's son. When Israel was a young nation, Hosea is telling us, God called the nation out of Egypt. But Matthew says that Jesus fulfilled this particular scripture. He's not saying that there's some prediction that Jesus fulfilled, but he's saying that Jesus fulfilled this scripture in some non-predictive way. Matthew sees this parallel between the nation of Israel and Egypt and Jesus. That's because Jesus represents the nation of Israel as its king. Some say that Jesus is the new Israel. That Jesus actually did what Israel was supposed to, such as be righteous and be a light to the Gentiles. So there's this relationship between Israel and Jesus as one of typology. What Israel as a nation did pictured in some way what the Messiah would do. Israel came out of Egypt as a picture that the Messiah would eventually come out of Egypt. Although he had to be born in Bethlehem, he had to grow up in Nazareth. There's different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle getting put into place by Jesus. But this works only when we look backwards. So we couldn't start with the Exodus out of Egypt and from that predict exactly what the Messiah would do. We couldn't predict the exact route that he took, or how fast he did it, or details like that. But Matthew is saying that in the overall picture, Jesus fulfilled the role of Israel by coming out of Egypt. And Matthew is telling us as readers to keep looking for other parallels between Jesus and the history of Israel. We see some parallels with Moses, for one thing. We'll see one later in the chapter. Jesus is picking up that story and making it his own. But we can go back to the story of Herod in verse 16. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi when they first saw that star. So it seems like 2 years had gone by, or maybe 1 year, and Herod was just erring on the, just to make sure. We have to allow for an unknown amount of travel time, some time for Herod to realize that these visitors weren't going to come back. So Herod decided to kill all these young boys in Bethlehem. Yeah, Bethlehem was a small town. Probably weren't a whole lot of baby boys in town at the time. Some scholars think there might have been 20. But Herod was known to kill people like that out of whim. And it sent a message to other cities in Judea and Galilee. It says, if you claim that one of your children is going to be the Messiah, I'll make sure that none of them are. So don't do that sort of thing. So one thing this story tells us is to remind us of why the Jewish people needed a new king of the Jews. The normal human way of using power is to use power against other people, to benefit one's own self. It happens in empires and nations and city governments and in churches and in marriages. People tend to look out for number one, meaning themselves first, their own group before other groups. This way of organizing human society is better than nothing, but nobody's perfect. It leads to sin and injustice. We need a new society and a new basis for relationships among friends and families, cities, states, and nations. And that's what Jesus brought. It didn't look like the old way, so a lot of people missed it. They were looking for a leader of the kind that they were used to, but Jesus came in a different way. God's kingdom had to start from the beginning, even from the birth of Jesus. We all need a new start in life, a new beginning, a new birth, just as the people of God needed a new start, just as the kingdom of God needed a completely new start. Jesus came to be a king, king of the Jews and king of the world, but he didn't come to use the same tactics as the previous kings did. Jesus doesn't slaughter all his rivals. He did not come to be Jesus the Great, who overthrows the Romans and rules with an iron fist. Jesus is great precisely because he doesn't rule by using those techniques. He's great even when he's a baby who has to be whisked out of town in order to save his life. Even when he's a baby, Gentile leaders come to bow before him, to give homage, to give him gifts. He's great even as a baby because his greatness comes in who he is, not in how much power he exercises over other people. What kind of Jesus are we looking for? You know, we really look forward to the day when Jesus will come back in power and he will use force to stop the evil rulers of this world. That will happen and it will be good. We will rejoice. But Christmas should make us stop and ask, do we rejoice when that power is still in its infancy? Do we give homage to Jesus? Do we bow down and worship him even when he isn't going to give us everything we want? We should. We need to remember what Jesus said. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you as well. If you want to follow me, you need to take up your cross and be willing to give up your life. Jesus isn't the sort of king that many people are looking for. And the costs of following him can sometimes be high. Matthew reminds us of that in verses 17 and 18. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. In this case, it was because of the slaughter of baby boys in Bethlehem. It's a grisly reminder of the powers. But the powers of this world don't want Jesus. They don't want rivals. But it is when we see those political leaders at their worst that we can also best see how necessary it is that they be replaced. Now, chances are we are not tempted to worship Herod. We don't use power the way he did. But perhaps we could see ourselves more in the category of the chief priests and teachers of the law. They had a comfortable life. They weren't too concerned about the needs of other people. They were not looking for a major shake-up in the way the world was run. They knew the Messiah was going to be born in one of the suburbs. Wise men came from a long distance claiming that the Messiah had indeed been born, but the local leaders didn't even bother to check it out. They weren't interested. And that happens among people today. Life is comfortable enough. Thank you very much. We don't want to have to rethink the way we live or what we're living for. We don't want to start all over. But I think we all need to be like the wise men and seek Jesus. Most of us are already Christians. We've already found Jesus, and we know everything we want to know about Him. We're comfortable in the way life currently is. But I think we all need to seek Him again, to keep learning from Him each year, to continue letting Him transform us, to be less like we used to be and more like He is in the way we think and act. We may not have any gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but what we have we can give to Jesus as a king and a priest and as someone who died for us. The gold reminds us that Jesus was born as King of the Jews and King of the world. He's a political leader, and we submit to Him everything in the political realm. Everything that was under the authority of kings, which in those days was about every material thing you can think of. Money, jobs, houses, allegiance. The frankincense reminds us that Jesus was born as a priest, and that's developed well in the book of Hebrews. We give to Jesus all our religious hopes for meaning in this life and for the life to come. We give Him allegiance in our thoughts and our actions. Now, the most interesting gift that Jesus was given was the myrrh, the burial ointment. Ordinary kings received gifts of gold, even incense, because it was a valuable commodity. But the gift of burial spices is unusual, and it illustrates how Jesus was different from other leaders. He was willing to die for us, and He did die for us. But most important for us, He reigned over death. Death did not hold Him. He had a victory over death, a victory that He shares with us, so that death won't hold us either. We'll live again with Jesus in eternity. But it comes with a willingness to die in this age. A willingness to set aside our selfish desires, a willingness to serve others, a willingness to be born anew, to start over, illustrated in this season by this strange combination of a baby king. In Jesus, the world starts over, and in Him, we start over as well. But as Matthew 2 tells us, the world doesn't like it. The world resists this new king, this new way of living, this new purpose for living. The world doesn't like it when we stop looking to the world for the way to live. When we stop giving our allegiance to the world's way of doing things. Sometimes there will be violent resistance against the new way, sometimes a more sophisticated belittling of what we believe. People will point out every inconsistency in what we do, calling it hypocrisy. Oh, they ignore their own hypocrisies. One thing that concerns me now is the political situation, in that Christianity is, in the minds of many people, has come to be identified with a particular political party. And all political parties have failures. In this case, the failures will be, unfortunately, blamed on Christians. But our hopes should not be in a political party, but in Jesus. Our allegiance should be to Him. Some political leaders help the gospel, some might oppose it. And since human beings are fallible, it could even be that the political leaders who help it one year could bring it into disrepute the next. That happens with church leaders too. They help it one year, and the next year there's a scandal, and it brings the gospel into disrepute. But politics is messy. Sometimes we need to hit the reset button, to start anew, to look to a baby as the one who's worthy of our allegiance. It's to Him that we bring our gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Well, back to the story of Jesus in verses 19 and 20. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who are trying to take the child's life are dead." Now, this is an echo of something that we read in Exodus, in the story of Moses. In that story, Moses had to flee away from Egypt. and after he had become a shepherd in the land of Midian. We read in Exodus 4 at verse 19, "Now the Lord had said to Moses in Midian, 'Go back to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead.'" The situations are almost the opposite, but the words are unusually similar. And most scholars conclude that Matthew wants his readers to see a parallel here between Moses and Jesus. That Jesus is the new Moses. Well, so Joseph got up, in verse 21, and he took the child and his mother and went back to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. See, when King Herod died, the Romans broke up his kingdom, gave part of it to his son Archelaus, and they gave Galilee to a different son, Herod Antipas. And now Archelaus was as brutal as his father was, or maybe more so. He was so brutal that the Romans removed him from power after 6 years, exiled him somewhere else. And they started ruling the province of Judea with procurators, like we find with Pilate later on. So, although it sounds like Joseph preferred to go to Judea, that was his first choice, but he thought it was too dangerous. So his only choice was to go to part of the land of Israel that was not ruled by Archelaus, and that would be the region of Galilee. This was confirmed to him in a dream, Matthew tells us. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. Verse 23, "And he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene." Now, it so happens that Nazareth was within walking distance of the city of Sepphoris, and Herod Antipas was starting to build up the city of Sepphoris. There was work for a carpenter there, and it's likely that Joseph did at least some of his work in Sepphoris, and later Jesus. But they lived in the town of Nazareth, and Matthew tells us that this fulfilled the prophecy. But we don't know where the prophecy is. Matthew just tells us that it was said. Perhaps it was an oral legend. Perhaps it was a play on words with the Hebrew word netzer, which means branch. And there are several Old Testament prophecies calling the Messiah a branch. But we really aren't sure of what Matthew means here. But this year, I want us to be reminded of how bizarre, how odd it is to worship a baby. But this is a reminder to us that God has just begun. The kingdom still has a lot of growing to do, and so do we. Sometimes we have growing pains. We are encouraged by the fact that Jesus did too. Everything we go through, He's already done it, and He's been victorious. He will be with us too. Emmanuel, God with us. From the womb to the tomb and into glory and eternity. Let's pray. Father, we do thank you for giving us the gift of Jesus, of yourself. We are humbled at the great thing that you have done. Jesus setting aside the glory that he had with you in heaven from past eternity and becoming a fragile and helpless baby for us. But we are encouraged by that too, to know that you have redeemed every aspect of our lives from birth to death and beyond. That we share in the victory that Jesus has gone through. Help us remember you and to worship you and Jesus forever. Amen.
Amen.